Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. We are continuing to sort through some of the big questions that people tend to have on their journey of faith, maybe some of the obstacles to faith, stumbling blocks, those kinds of things. We're getting close to wrapping this up. We've got one more week with one more question, and then after that, the weekend of Thanksgiving, we're going to have an Ask the Pastor day, just an open mic. We'll have a couple of microphones out here, and you can come up and ask me any question you would like. So you will write the sermon on that day, but just make sure we don't miss anything. And so, but we've been going through this in the fall, wanting to honestly and openly deal with these questions. These are good questions. The God of the Bible does not have a problem with questions. If he does, he sure gets asked a lot of them by the prophets and by the kings and by other people in scriptures. And so it's good to be able to bring our questions and deal with them in community. This is not just an academic exercise. I do this for a couple of reasons. One is to strengthen your own faith. I realize that wherever we are on the spiritual journey, we're in different places, and many of us are asking these questions and dealing with these ourselves. So we want to help there. But then also I want to help your ministry, because you have friends that are in different stages of faith, and they are asking these questions. So I want to give you some foundation in that and help you have some answers so that you're not caught off guard. These are legitimate questions. They deserve legitimate consideration. Now, today, we're going to come to the seeming battle between faith and science. Hasn't science disproved Christianity? Hasn't science made religion unnecessary? I mean, come on, back in the day when we didn't know, and yeah, we needed religion when we thought that, lightning was caused by the gods or something, or weather and patterns were all these dynamics. But now we have science. We understand cosmology. We understand biology. We understand all these different dynamics. So has science done away with God, with religion? Certainly there is a crop of new atheists that argue that science has done just that. Famously, the British biologist Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins argues it's impossible to be an intellectual scientist and hold any religious belief. Well, I would say he should take that up with Francis Collins. Francis Collins is the head of the Human Genome Project and the current head of the National Institutes of Health. He is our nation's leading scientist and a very committed Christian. I would highly recommend you his book, The Language of God. It tells his story of going from an atheist to a Christian as an adult. He had a conversion experience, and very, very powerful book. Talks about the science of the Genome Project and how he links that to God, all these kind of things. But Collins is not alone. A very famous study that was done in 1917 and again in 1997, about 100 years apart, or close to it, not 100 years apart, long distance apart. And 100 years ago, the results, they asked scientists, professional scientists, if they believed that there was a God, a personal God, like who answered prayers and stuff. And the results came back. 40% said yes, 40% said no, 20% said I don't know. Okay? When they asked them again about a decade ago, exact same results. Okay? Now, that's a lot less than the 83% of Americans in general who answer that question in the affirmative, but it's not no one. There are plenty of Christian scientists around. But I want to talk about this in a way that's helpful, and I've really wrestled this week with how to handle this topic. To be honest, I know less about this subject than any other ones that we've talked about, and I've taught less on it. And so I did what I usually do when I'm going to a subject. I start reading about it. So I read a lot. And I mean a lot. And everything I read took me into a deeper corner and a darker place and just kept going and going. It's like, how are we going to synthesize all this dynamic? There's such a wide spectrum of belief on this science versus faith issue, even within Christian circles. Just a number of approaches to the whole science-faith dynamic. So how do we handle it? Well, we could talk about miracles. Doesn't science disprove the supernatural, rational versus supernatural? Well, we spent a whole series talking about miracles a couple of summers ago, and so if you want to hear about that, you can go back. It was called Supernatural Summer. Look that up on the website. Another big topic, of course, is evolution. Ever since the fundamentalist progressive split in the 1920s, represented kind of by the famous Scopes trial. Darwinian evolution has been the front lines of the conflict between faith and science, certainly in the news media. And that could be a very interesting conversation for us. Trust me, there is no shortage of information out there. We could weigh all the options from scientific creationism, both the long earth and short earth versions of that, to intelligent design, which actually is not creationism, all the way over to the angle of theistic evolution, or the more marketable term, biologos. We could easily spend a morning doing that, but we're not going to. And one of the reasons is that I'm not a scientist, and I try to be humble about things that I don't fully understand, even though I usually fail at that. But bigger than that is I don't think it's actually a very helpful approach. I think it's asking the wrong question. I think a lot of the conflict between science and faith that we see, or at least see portrayed today, is quite frankly unnecessary. I think it's more of a power play, okay, on both sides to be sure, but it's the kind of power play which, for the Christian at least, the gospel is actually opposed to. So maybe I should say I'm not sure the real battle today is over what is truth, but over who gets to control truth. So how will we approach this morning? Well, I'm not a scientist, but I am an historian, all right, undergraduate in history from the University of Texas, and currently working on a doctorate in historical theology, so in the dissertation phase on that. So when I want to understand things in life, just the way I'm wired, I tend to go and look at the past. You know, how did these ideas develop? How did we get here? How did people in previous generations deal with these questions? Were they even asking these questions? And what has changed and why? And so as I have studied these issues this week, I've come to the determination that we are fundamentally asking the wrong questions, because in the end, science isn't religion and religion isn't science. They have different processes, different purposes, and they're really addressing different things. And I hope to show you that we need them both. Now, I have to say up front, this is a different morning for us. I don't even know if I should call this a sermon, or if I should call this a lecture, or a TED Talk, or what it is. But we're going to go a little bit more into the mental dynamics of things. Jesus said that we're to love God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. And so this is going to be a lot more of the kind of mental growth dynamics this morning. But here's my thesis for us today. I want you to remember this, okay? Maybe write this down. This might be one to take some notes on, jot down some dates and things. But I hope it makes sense by the time we get to the end of our talk. Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Okay, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Science is a search for explanation. Religion is a search for meaning. And taken together, these two essential perspectives allow us to see the universe in its true multidimensional form. We are lessened as a species when we try to do away with either of the disciplines. Okay, we need them both, and I hope to convince us of that in the only way I know how, which is investigating the past as a way of understanding the present. Okay, so I want to start today, oddly enough, with a discussion of language. Anthropologists, okay, specifically linguistic anthropologists, have discovered something about the birth of languages which may seem trivial, but by the time that we walk through all this, I hope you'll actually see is actually pivotal to understanding how the world works. And I think it ultimately answers our question of the whole science versus religion debate. Okay, you ready? Might want to hold on to your seats. Okay, here we go. Has everyone been to the restroom? Does anybody need a... Okay, here we go. Alphabets without vowels, like Hebrew and Arabic, are written from right to left, and alphabets with vowels, like English, are written from left to right. Now, this time, I need everybody to check on your neighbor and see if anybody needs medical attention, because I know that just blew you. It was very exciting, right? It's very exciting. listen, if you didn't know that Hebrew reads right to left, I brought a little illustration. This is actually a Hebrew text. This is the Torah, or the what we would call the books of Moses, the first 5 books of our Old Testament. And this is the front of it. And you open it this way, and you read it from right to left as you go through. That is the Hebrew way of doing things. And it's kind of a fascinating process. I'll leave this up here afterwards if you want to have a look at it. But I don't mention that because it's kind of a fascinating thing. No, it actually matters, and I have come to believe it matters quite a lot. Here's why. You see, in languages in which there are vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, words can be recognized and understood systematically on their own. You can just look at a word individually and tell what it is, right? So, what's this word? Cat. Very good. You've all done very well. Very limited ambiguity in meaning, right? Meow, kitty. There we go. Cat. Okay. But in languages like Hebrew, where there are no letters for vowels, it's very hard to tell what a word is just by looking at it on its own. So, for instance, what is this word? HT. That's how you would see it in Hebrew, obviously in the Hebrew language, but HT. Well, that could be hat, hot, hit, hut, heat, or hate. You can only tell what the word is by seeing it in its context. You have to see everything around it, okay? So, if you saw this sentence, come over by the fire and HT yourself, what then could you surmise that that word means? Heat, okay? Unless you had just eaten an entire pizza for dinner, in case you might want to sit down and hate yourself, which is what I have been known to do in the past. So simply knowing how to read a word involves a different skill set depending on how it is written, with verbs or without. Okay? One involves systematic processing, and the other involves a more holistic understanding of things. And these skill sets realize different mental operations. For the last 150 years, since we have discovered that the language center of the brain is located in the left hemisphere, neuroscientists have come to understand some marked differences between the brain's 2 hemispheres and how they process information. We learned in school about the whole left brain, right brain thing, right? It's actually very complicated, more complicated than I have time to get into, because the brain there's some plasticity there, there's some back and forth, and we're learning more and more about some things float between. But in general, and this is as much psychology as it is neuroscience, but we have these general tiers where the left hemisphere tends to be more analytical, linear, mechanical, right? Anybody nudging their left brain husband, you know, engineer Bob, like, yep, that's where they are. The right brain tends to be more integrative and holistic. It looks for patterns of connection. Okay, this is the fine arts person, or the liberal arts person, like I was. So the right brain sees the forest, the left brain sees the trees. Make sense? And the right brain then is big on empathy. It's big on emotions. This is where we read situations and atmospheres and moods. It's the right brain that looks at your boss and whispers to you, don't ask for the raise today. Okay, you just read that whole picture, and that's very right brain thinking. Okay, now, the 2 hemispheres control opposite sides of the body. So, if you have a stroke in the right side of your brain, you would lose function on the left side of your body. If you have a left hemisphere stroke, you would droop or lose function on the right side of your body. Yes, so they control opposite sides. So, languages with vowels, where words can be understood one by one, systematically use the left side of the brain. And so we read them from right to left. Our eyes move from left to right. Let me get it right. Okay, left to right, allowing our left side of the brain to be engaged. Okay? Letters of the alphabet are alphabets that don't have vowels, that are looking more holistically, they're looking at context. They are going to read that from right to left, their eyes going to the left, focusing and bringing into power the right side of the brain. Okay? This makes sense now? You're with me? So we've got these 2 dynamics. Now, this is where someone should stand up and say, objection, relevance. And I would say, Your Honor, I'm going somewhere with this. The judge would say, I'll allow it, but counselor, I'm going to warn you, you're on thin ice. Okay, I watched a lot of courtroom dramas. But we're going somewhere with this. Let me tell you why this matters, okay? Before I can tell you why it matters, let me tell you about two inventions that absolutely transformed the ancient world, okay? The first one is the invention of writing. Writing was invented about 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The birth of writing was the birth of civilization because it enabled a growth of knowledge to become cumulative, okay? You could now write knowledge down and share it and add to it as you passed it on to successive generations. Yep. So writing was really key, and writing evolved from pictograms. You would do drawings of symbols that represented something. So if you wanted to write bird, you drew a little picture of a bird, right? The hieroglyphics, we say this. But this actually made learning difficult because we know that, for instance, Egyptian hieroglyphics had 700 symbols. Well, that's hard to memorize 700 symbols, which meant it would always remain writing a closely guarded skill set of the literary elite. So what broke the doors of knowledge open and made possible the dream of universal literacy was the invention of the alphabet. So writing, yes, very important, but the alphabet was absolutely crucial. The first alphabet that we know of is called Proto-Sinaitic, and it's dated to around 1800 BC. Okay? It was found in 1905 by a British archaeologist in the Sinai desert near some turquoise mines that actually date back to the time of the pharaohs. And they speculate that this kind of proto-Jewish alphabet was left there by Hebrew slaves, maybe working in the mines, perhaps even on their journey to the Promised Land. The geography works for that. The general time frame we think the Exodus happens could work for that as well. So it's highly likely that the Jews gave the world its alphabet. In fact, even the word we use itself signals this. Alphabet is made up of the first two letters of the Hebrew script, Aleph and Bet. So when you're saying alphabet, you're saying the first two letters of Hebrew. And those early alphabets, okay, like Hebrew today, had no vowels and were read from right to left. Okay? And then eventually, like 1,000 years eventually, this Hebrew alphabet made its way by the Phoenician seafaring peoples over into Greece around 900 BC. Okay, so the alphabet we think was invented about 1800 BC, makes its way to Greece about 900 BC. A lot of similarities. The first four letters of the Greek alphabet mirror the Hebrew exactly. Okay, where are my sorority sisters? Where's the Greek? We got alpha, beta, gamma, delta, right? Oh, but what the Greeks added literally changed the world. Okay? English is based on a Greek alphabet. So what comes after A, B, C, D? E. Yeah, E, epsilon, E. It's fun to preach to smart people here, you know, your alphabet. They added vowels, okay? And after about 100 years, something else happened in the Greek language. They began to write, not right to left, they begin to write left to right, which now, neurologically, we understand why, right? You're using different parts of the brain to process those letters, see? Now the words were stand-along wholes. You could read them systematically, not just narratively. Now, as all of this was happening in Greece, something else was evolving. As the Greeks learned to write down knowledge, they were also developing new types of knowledge to write down. Science began in Greece in the 6th century BC. You usually think it began with Thales, who identified water as an element, but there were all kinds of them. Heraclitus, Pythagoras, anybody remember his theorem from school, right? Democritus, who believed that the universe was composed of elementary particles that he called atoms. Still use his terminology all these years later. These were the first people to think about nature systematically. These were the first scientists. Okay? The same period, though, saw the birth of philosophy, the search for the true, the good, the beautiful. Bedrock names like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Plato, in particular, shaped the direction of Western thought from that day to this. Plato gave us moral universalism. Now, that sounds like a big term. It is incredibly important. That teaches that there is a truth that is true in every culture and at every time. This is the foundation of scientific evidence and experimentation. Because if you can prove that something is true, it will be universally true. If you can prove it's true in Greece, it will be true in Peru. It will be true in Africa. There's a universal truth, you see. This became the new standard of knowledge. Either you can prove it or you can't. See, it is impossible to overstate the significance of ancient Greek philosophy and science on the development of Western civilization. We owe virtually all of our abstract concepts to the Greeks. The Hebrew Bible knows no such ideas. Listen, in the Hebrew Bible there is a creation story. Actually, there's more than one. But there is no theological discussion in Genesis about what the basic elements of the universe are. What's the building blocks of the universe? No, when the Hebrew Bible wants to explain something, it does not articulate a theory, it tells a story. Okay, take for example the birth of monarchy. In the Greeks, you can see Aristotle and Plato arguing about, the nature and the nuance of kings versus democracy versus aristocracy. In the Hebrew Bible, they just tell you a story. Well, we had Samuel, and then we had Saul, and then we had David. See, that's where their interest lies, in the relationships, not in the concepts. There's honestly deep ambivalence in the Old Testament about, whether or not monarchy, kings are good, bad, indifferent. Was it a necessary evil? It's just never laid out systematically, because that's just not a very Hebrew thing to do. So could it be that the difference between these two cultures, between Athens and Jerusalem, has something to do with how their respective alphabets were written? Greece, at the time their alphabet was adding vowels and shifting from right to left to right, was becoming the world's first and greatest left-brain culture. This cannot be a coincidence. Greece and Israel, Athens and Jerusalem in antiquity offer us the sharpest possible contrast between a predominantly left-brain society and a right-brain society. Okay? Now, they were both very literate cultures with high regard for discipleship and study. They both placed high priorities on education and the pursuit of wisdom. They both valued sages and teachers. Okay? Teachers were heroes, both among the Jews and the Greeks. But their cognitive styles were different, just as their alphabets were written in different directions. So they valued different things. The Greeks worshipped human reason, the Jews divine revelation. The Greeks gave the Western world its philosophy and science. The Jews gave it prophets and religious faith. Okay? We can grasp kind of this modern view today if we look at some of the differences between the Eastern world and the Western world. China is another culture that reads from right to left. And China, really, most all East Asian cultures tend to be more relationally centered than we individualistic Westerners are. Give you an example of this. The famous American primer you learn to read? See Dick run, see Dick play, right? A Chinese primer from the same era of time begins this way. Big brother takes care of little brother. Big brother loves little brother. Little brother loves big brother. See, East puts things together in relationships. West breaks things down into component parts. It's a very famous study that was done of children who were shown three objects. They were shown a chicken, a cow, and a clump of grass. We got the picture up there, guys. There you go. Chicken, cow, clump of grass. And they asked the children, which two of these go together? Okay. Now, the majority of the American children said the chicken and the cow. They are of a like kind. They're of the same, same class. Japanese children, the majority of them chose the cow and the grass. Because where there are cows, there is grass. Right? There's a relationship to this. Americans tend to think in terms of individual rights, and Chinese tend to think in terms of communal values. Okay, now, this matters. Anthropologists have long been struck by the fact that, listen, in spite of the extraordinary technological breakthroughs in ancient Chinese society, they got to paper and ink and printing and gunpowder and the compass way before we did in the West, and yet they never developed a scientific revolution like you see in Western civilization. Greeks think linearly. This leads to this, leads to this, which is the scientific process. It revolves in this step to this step to progress. Chinese tend to think circularly. Think about reincarnation. It's this idea that you are returning to the communal familiarity rather than pressing forward for breakthrough progress. And by the way, Hebrew thinking is the same way. Not about reincarnation, but it's very circular. I used to have it when I went to seminary in my post-undergrad. I had two New Testament professors. One was very Jewish in his thinking, and one was very Greek in his thinking. I would leave with different kinds of notes. Dr. Hernando was very regimented. I'd have A follows B follows C, and a whole 6 pages of notes. And Dr. Aker, I'd leave with like some scribbles and some things and some, wow, this was interesting. Honestly, over time, I would say Dr. Aker had a bigger impact on my life than Dr. Hernando, but I could sure read Dr. Hernando's notes better. It's just a different way of processing information, see? The Jews also never really developed a scientific community in spite of their incredible emphasis on education until really the Middle Ages. They were just thinking about things differently. Left brain culture, right brain culture. Okay, now, I'm not making a value statement here. To ask which is more important, left side of the brain or the right side of the brain, is like asking, which side of the heart is more important? Left ventricle or right ventricle? Can I have both? Right? They both do different things. We need them both working together, see? Because they give us different things. There are truths that we can express in systems, but others that we can only tell through story. There is a kind of knowledge which only comes through detachment, through breaking things down to component parts. But there is a knowledge that can only be known through attachment, through empathy and holistic interaction with each other. Makes sense? You need both. Now, let's not lose sight of the goal here. What I'm trying to show you is that there is a profound difference between two modes of thinking of which religion and science are the supreme examples. There is a cultural complementary difference between Athens and Jerusalem. Remember, science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Could it be that a simple contrast between right to left and left to right language might account for the vast difference between these two cultures and subsequently between their two radically different ways of viewing the world? But that's not the end of it. Because history records that an event occurred which led to a unique synthesis between the worlds of Athens and Jerusalem. It lasted for 17 centuries, and at its pinnacle, it brought together the greatest synthesis of arts, religion, and science that the world has ever seen. But then it began to break apart. And the unraveling has led to just the conflict that we are having today. The unraveling is the reason I have included this sermon in my series on questions and challenges to faith. So let me show you 3 things about this synthesis. We're going to see its birth, its advancement, and its collapse. First of all, its birth. Something happened in the first century that brought Athens and Jerusalem together, and it was so powerful that we have literally shifted our entire calendar around this event. Okay, what year is it? Not a trick question. Come on. 2018. All right, it's 2018. What? A.D. We literally, I said it wrong. 2017. Getting ahead of myself. Who's the moron now? 2017 A.D. All right? We literally judge what has happened now from back to this time. It is a moment in history built around the life, the death, and the resurrection of a man named Jesus of Nazareth and the movement he founded that's come to be known as Christianity. Okay? Listen, Jesus was a Jew. He lived in the land of Israel, mainly around the region of Galilee, in and around Jews. He spoke to them as a Jew. He read the Bible and almost certainly prayed in Hebrew, which, by the way, meant he read a language from right to left without any vowels in it. Okay? Now, Jesus spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of the school and the marketplace that would have been the lingua franca of first century Palestinian Jews. And whenever we read a direct, untranslated speech of Jesus in the gospel, he's almost always speaking Aramaic. When he brings a little dead girl back to life, he says, Talita kum, which is Aramaic for little girl, get up. When he's expressing to us how to pray, he addresses God as Abba, which is the Aramaic word for daddy, very personal word. Probably most famously from the cross, he speaks an Aramaic translation of a line from Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus was a Jew who spoke Hebrew and its linguistic cousin, Aramaic. But every single book of the New Testament is written in Greek. That is an extraordinary fact. Even the Old Testament that was known to Christians for centuries, it's called the Septuagint, was a 3rd century BC Greek translation of the Hebrew. So even when Greek Christians were reading the Old Testament, they were reading it in Greek instead of Hebrew. And as we have hopefully proven this morning, the way you speak influences how you think. Anthropologists are united that language shapes culture way more than culture shapes language. I'll give you an example. Greek versus Hebrew. Think of the word to know. Just the concept of to know something in Greek knowledge speaks of mastery of a subject. Do you know your math tables? Do you know the material for the exam? In Hebrew, the word for knowledge primarily is a word speaking to relationship, and specifically intimate levels of relationship. I know my wife. See, that matters. And within the first decade of Jesus' death and resurrection, the church found itself at a crossroads. They had the potential to move in one of two directions. And you actually see this tension when you read the letters of the New Testament that were written in the second half of the 1st century. Would the focus of the church be a Jewish sect located in Jerusalem under Jesus' brother James? Okay? Or would its center be with the Mediterranean Hellenistic Gentiles who looked to Paul as their primary example? Well, history tells us it was the Greek, okay, not the Hebrew and Aramaic speaking population, that proved to be the fertile soil in which Christianity took root and grew. And there are a lot of historical reasons for this. I think probably the biggest is what occurred in AD 70 when the Romans marched in and completely destroyed Jerusalem. Wiped the town out, didn't leave one stone on top of the other. The balance shifted to Athens because Jerusalem quite literally ceased to exist. Of course, I also think that the sovereignty of God played a large role in this. I don't think it was an accident. I think God always intended for the synthesis of the two great cultures of the world to unite under the gospel. But it is absolutely true that Christianity is a religion whose sacred texts are written in a language that its founder would have found foreign and largely unintelligible. There's a good bit of debate about whether Jesus would have even been able to read the New Testament. Two different cultures, two different ways of thinking and being coming together in this new movement called Christianity. Okay? But that still doesn't explain why it changed the world. We still haven't discussed what brought Christianity to its prominence. Okay? For that, we have to go to another moment in history, now to AD 312, when the Emperor Constantine turned a small and often persecuted sect into the official religion of the Roman Empire. It was an astonishing, improbable event that eventually transformed the world. And it was, at the same time, both the best and worst thing that ever happened to Christianity. There's a church historian, he's one of my favorites, named David Bentley Hart. And he writes this. He said, "It is hardly novel to observe that Christianity's greatest historical triumph was also its most calamitous defeat. With the conversion of the Roman Empire, the faith that was born proclaiming the overthrows of the powers of this age all at once found itself in alliance with, subordinate to, and too often emulous of those powers." Listen, we must be very careful to distinguish between Christianity and Christendom. Okay? Christianity is the gospel of Jesus Christ through his death and his resurrection and what that means to transform the entire world. Christendom is about a geopolitical power structure that's goal is dominance and control of the world. Christendom is about competition over and against the powers of pagans and infidels. Historically, predominantly Muslims, and ironically, even Jews. And I am running out of time to tell you the whole story of the Middle Ages and all these things, but eventually, this unique fusion of Jerusalem and Athens that emerged with Christianity lost sight of its Hebrew roots altogether. And that produced a hairline fracture in the church that would not begin to be truly felt in structural weakness until the 17th century. Okay? The bone wasn't sticking out yet, but make no mistake, the arm was broken. Okay? Oh, but it was great while it lasted. It was an incredible run. One of the most glorious periods in European history occurred when religion and science and arts came together in the Renaissance. The Renaissance Manifesto, the Oration of the Dignity of Man, was a deeply religious document. And in Italy, it gave rise to Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael and Botticelli. In England, to Francis Bacon and Marlowe and Shakespeare and Milton. It was religious humanism at its best. But at the same time, you had 2 centuries of religious wars that absolutely tore the continent apart in the name of faith. At the same time came the confrontation between the religious authorities and Galileo, right? And the church is wrong and the scientist is right. And the synthesis was beginning to unravel. The break in the bone was becoming painful. And the Renaissance was closely followed by the Enlightenment. Science fought back against the ignorant power plays of the church. There was actually a lot of debate about exactly what it was that enabled the 17th century to be the place where experimental science was birthed. Some people actually argue that it was because of religion. You know, Protestantism in general or Calvinism in particular. Maybe. It's pretty complicated. But I'm persuaded that a large role was actually a reaction to the failure of religion in the period. All of that religious violence, and the Catholics persecuted the Protestants persecuted the Anabaptists, and the Anabaptists, it just went down the line. And that kind of thing led figures like Descartes and Newton to seek certainty and truth on the basis of a structure of knowledge that did not rest on dogmatic foundations. Let's get this to rest on human reason, not on what the Pope says, or not on what this bishop says. But one way or another, first science and then philosophy declared their independence from theology, and the great arc stretching from Athens to Jerusalem finally began to crumble. And I maintain that that is the reason for the conflict that we feel today between science and faith. When David Hume and Immanuel Kant in the Enlightenment disproved God, What they were disproving were Greek foundations of the proof of God that came from Aquinas by way of Aristotle. That's Greek thinking, but have no basis in the Hebrew Scriptures. Genesis 1:1 begins, in the beginning, God. The Jews never made an attempt to prove that God existed. The thought would never have entered their mind. Remember Plato's universal proofs? You can either prove it or you can't. That is not a Hebrew concept. What they were concerned with was relationship with this God who was their provider and their deliverer and their sovereign king. Not breaking the universe down into its component parts. That's Greek, not Hebrew. Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Science studies behavior. If I raise my arm, science can tell me about bone structure and muscle movement and neurological connections. But it cannot tell me about meaning and purpose. Did I raise my hand to high-five you or to slap you? To ask a question or to praise Jesus? See, that requires other disciplines, and we need both of them. When religion and science began to go their separate ways, it was the human race that suffered. And we need to declare a truce. But between these two equally essential aspects of the human condition. And listen, I understand how we got there. And to be honest, the church has to repent first. For too long, a church dominated by fear instead of faith has declared war on what it does not understand. But I think the answer is not to instill scientists in the dominant role and let them persecute religion. Again, I understand why they would want that after 500 years of history. But can we dare to learn from history, not just repeat it? So how do we do that? How do we do that? I think the answer lies in going back, okay? Not to the Renaissance, not to the pinnacles of Christendom and Christian power. No, I think many of the tensions we feel today in the religion versus culture wars are more about defending a dying geopolitical power structure than about standing up for the true gospel. No. We got to look back all the way to Jesus. We got to look back to this Jewish carpenter from Nazareth who the Apostle John called the Logos, the highest Greek ideal of meaning, but who himself claimed to be the very Son of God who could bring all of us into relationship with God through his story. That's what matters. Jesus didn't die on the cross to replace the Roman Empire with another form of worldly imperial power. He died in weakness for a persecuted people to usher in the very kingdom of God on earth. And that is a kingdom that has survived and thrived in pockets across every language and every governmental structure in the history of mankind. So that Chinese-speaking Christians under communism and English-speaking Americans under democracy can worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob side by side, each calling each other children of the King because they are brothers and sisters of Jesus. Do you see how radical that is? Do you see how much more transformative that is than just another tired debate about Darwin versus Adam and Eve? Listen, I can talk to you about that stuff. I've formed some opinions. But how helpful is that really? And I'm sure there are some of you that are rather irritated with me because I have failed to render judgment on these, various views. Maybe that's what you came for. I want to know which one's right and which one's wrong. But let me ask you this. If you knew the exact moment that life appeared from nothingness, whether that was 4,000 years ago or 14 billion, how would that change your life? Would it make any difference at all? Would you celebrate that? Would you hold an annual holiday to commemorate that moment? Would it change the way you deal with your spouse and your children and the way you deal with your ethics at work? If you knew exactly how God did it, would that make you more likely to want a relationship with him? I don't think so. But if you get to know God through the person of Jesus Christ, if you understood what he did on the cross for you, if you confess that the only miracle that really matters is that a man was raised from the dead so that you can live forever, that will transform your life. Just as it has transformed the lives of billions of people across time and space of human history. See, can I just tell you guys, we don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be afraid. Jesus brought us faith, not fear, and science cannot take that away from you. The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome, and he can be worshipped in the cathedral, and he can be worshipped in the laboratory. And his creation, all of it, is majestic and awesome and intricate and beautiful, and it is not at war with itself. Only fallen, fearful human beings can create these kinds of wars. But that just might mean that we can end them. Let me pray for you. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. God, that begins the words of the Apostles' Creed that men and women have recited in different languages and different nationalities for, 1,800 years, 1,700 years, long time, God. And we confess that. God, the creator of heaven and earth, God, you are the creator of all things seen and unseen. I will go to the flames over that. I believe that with all my heart. That's the foundation of everything. Now, how you did that? I'm going to maintain some humility there, God. We've got to do this. That we don't know everything in that dynamic, and so God, we want to be humble in these things. But we want to make sure that we get the big things to be the big things, God. That we see what you've done on the cross through your Son Jesus Christ. Lord, and we got to confess as a church that we have got to get back to the Jewish roots of our faith. We've got to get back to this synthesis of there's no accidents in this, God. I believe that however this world came together, all the natural processes, that you have a hand in that. That you set those things into motion. God, and the same thing is true in history. Yes, you gave us free will, and we get to make choices, and that messes things up, just like it does in nature. It does in history. And yet, God, somehow, you are sovereign over that whole process in ways that we cannot possibly understand. But God, would you help us see that the number one thing that you've called us to do is not, God, to build another kingdom of dominance and power, just to go out and control school boards, to go out and get this in a book or that in a book. No, what you've called us to do is live our lives in a way that mirror that Jewish carpenter who loved people that persecuted him so much that he was willing to lay down his life for them. He was a God that came into the world, and he said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve. To serve people on both sides of the spectrums. He served the Romans and he served the Jews. They both got together and killed him for it. But God, that's what you've called us to through the gospel. And that's what will change our life. That's what will put aside all these wars, where this person does it to this person, and so that person does it back to these people, and then science does it to religion, so religion does it back to science. God, the only thing that's going to put an end to that is when we look to the cross of Jesus Christ, and we take that into us. God, would you make us agents of reconciliation in our world? Father, that we would go to our classrooms tomorrow, to our workplaces, to our neighborhoods, and we would have maybe a little different mentality to it. Little less quick to argue, little less quick to debate, and more likely to listen, more likely to serve, more likely to be the hands of Jesus Christ in that community until they ask us why. And we can tell them the story of this Jewish carpenter who changed the world. God, let that start in us, in our hearts, in this church, in this place, so it can spread throughout at least this little corner of this beautiful world that you've created for us to live in. We pray this in Jesus' name.